Hi there, sophomores. Today we're going to be talking about poetry from the Romantic period, which took place between 1800 and 1850. This primarily took place in the UK with British poets, and we're going to be looking at a couple of them, not all of them by any means, but today we're going to be taking a look at William Wordsworth, which is a pretty fitting last name for somebody who is good with words, I guess. So, first, before we get into Wordsworth and what his life was like and what his poetry is like, let's talk about the Romantic period in general, and a couple of things that it's not. First of all, the Romantic period has nothing to do with William Shakespeare. While he did write romantic plays, he wrote poetry that could be seen as romantic, he was very aware of love and how it feels to fall in love and be heartbroken. It has nothing to do with Shakespeare. He would have been well before this time. These poets might have taken inspiration from Shakespeare, but they definitely didn't have any connections to Shakespeare himself. So it's not about William Shakespeare. Another thing we're not concerned with is our modern ideas of romance or romantic love. Okay, while there might be some elements of that in some of these poems, we're definitely not talking about Nicholas Sparks or Valentine's Day candies or cutesy pictures with your significant other or long walks on the beach. Okay, we're not concerned with any of those things because romantic doesn't have to do necessarily with a relationship. It has more to do with just intense feelings overall. Not necessarily intense feelings of love, but feeling every emotion that you can feel and feeling it very deeply and very honestly. So we're not talking about our modern ideas of love and romance when I say the Romantic period. So if you think this is going to be a bunch of gushy roses are red, violets are blue kind of poems, you're going to be a little disappointed.
The Romantic period was a literary, musical, cultural, and intellectual movement. So it focused on really powerful and dramatic feelings. There was an emphasis on emotion, feeling all of the feelings and feeling them extremely deeply. There was a focus on heightened senses. So everything that you're feeling is heightened by the things that you touch, the things that you taste, the things that you see or hear, okay? All of the senses really came together to enhance these powerful feelings that people were trying to communicate. There was also a really large interest with the sublime, meaning there was an interest in what lies beyond the tangible life that we're living. Is there something more out there? Is there something deeper to this life? Why are we living life? What's the point? Okay, that's the sublime. There is also an emphasis on imagination. Instead of just rotely or routinely describing things in poetry, everything that became more grand or heightened in the poetry was a result of this imagination, trying to perceive something, a feeling, as being something tangible. You'll also notice a common theme with a fascination of nature, very similar to the transcendentalists that we talked about during American literature last semester. These poets would have been highly influenced by the nature around them, this big grand landscape. And what we might think of as being kind of silly today was actually very important to them because they were immersed in it. They didn't have technology or modern advancements to occupy their time. They spent a lot of time in nature and grew a great appreciation for that. You'll work more with nature as the unit moves on, including watching a brief video in tomorrow's class. Okay, but nature is going to be a really key component, and the beauty and the grandeur and the majesty of nature that surrounds you and how small we are in comparison to the beauty of nature around us. And finally, the supernatural. So things that deal with the spiritual realm, much like the sublime, the supernatural was very intriguing to the poets of the time. Is there something that causes us to behave a certain way or do certain things? Is there something else working in our lives rather than our own decisions? Okay, so those are some brief characteristics. I'm also going to show you a few pieces of art in our discussion of the Romantic period, like this one from the French Revolution. Okay, so what we see around the woman holding the flag is a lot of death and destruction from this revolution, but in the midst of it, you get this woman who is a lot lighter, so your eye is attracted to this middle of the frame, and she's waving the French flag in victory. So even though there is a lot of death and destruction that they needed to go through to get to this point, there is victory on the horizon, okay? So it's very dramatic. The colors are light and dark, and they contrast, and they draw your eye through the painting, much like our poetry is going to do, per line, per stanza. Again, powerful feelings, not necessarily those of love, while those might occur in some of these poems, just feeling all of the feelings very deeply. Here's another painting called The Lady of Shalott by John William Waterhouse. Now, this is one of my favorite paintings of all time, partially because of the story that it's referring to. It's based on a poem from the same time period about this woman who is weaving this tapestry that you can see hanging off the side of the boat. And she's up in a tower weaving this tapestry, and she's under a curse, so she's not allowed to look outside the window or something bad will happen. And we're not, as an audience member, told what bad things are going to happen until one day she does actually look out her window and away from her tapestry, and she sees Sir Lancelot riding by. And she falls so deeply in love with Sir Lancelot. She feels those feelings of romantic love and is just taken over by them. And she wants nothing more than to be with him. It starts to eat away at her until one day that she escapes from her tower and makes her way down to the water after not eating, not taking care of herself, nothing. She's next to death here. So you can see her face is very desperate. Her cheeks are kind of sunken in. Her hair is frizzled and frayed. And she's doing this one last desperate thing to try and earn Sir Lancelot's attention. So as she floats down this river, in the painting you can notice that on the tapestry on the side of the boat, there are some vignettes, and one looks like a knight riding by. But the main point is all of this leads up to the finale of the poem, in which she floats down this river to where Lancelot is, and in the process ends up dying. And at the very, very end of the poem, in a tragic twist of fate, Lancelot sees her and comments on how beautiful she was and what a shame it was that she died the way that she did. Okay, so it's not just the romantic feelings of love, but it's feeling all of the feelings and feeling them extremely deeply. And the art and the poetry and the music all go hand in hand during this period of time. They all strive for the same themes and get the same messages across. A lot of them worked hand in hand, like this painting based on the poem. So let's talk about William Wordsworth a little bit. There's a painting of him kind of in his prime when he was most prolific with his poetry. He's frequently called the father of English Romanticism, meaning that he's the head honcho, right? He is the leader, he is the guy who created this movement. He was deeply influenced by the passing of his mother. Both of his parents passed away before he was 13, so he dealt with these really tragic events, causing him to have to come to terms with his emotions very early on. And so that was kind of the beginning of his fascination with poetry and the written word. He grew up in an area of the UK called the Lake District, which you'll look at more tomorrow in a brief video. But basically, it was a very rural area, very hilly, so there's a lot of rolling hills around him, a lot of wooded area, a lot of streams and lakes, as the name of the area would suggest. And he became fascinated by nature and how beautiful and epic and sweeping it is. This is before the development, the industrialization of a lot of areas, and so this was really untouched natural area. This comes through in many of his poems. He also studied philosophy when he was in school. He was very intrigued by philosophy, but he was also frustrated by philosophy, which at the time had very rigid rules. He was more of a free thinker. Philosophy was a little bit more kind of a Debbie Downer at the time, and Wordsworth wanted to feel the feelings. So with that in mind, he broke conventions of the time, for sure, with poetry in his poetic form. And in this time period, poetry was viewed as being something that only intellectuals would do. It was an intellectual activity. So the smart people, quote unquote, would be the ones writing the poems for other smart people, quote unquote. And Wordsworth decided, that's not how poetry should be. Poetry should be a very deep personal connection, a very deep snapshot of human emotion and human feelings. And everybody, intellectual or not, can relate to certain human emotions. not everybody can relate to the intellectual side of things. So he wrote poetry not just for himself, not just for scholars, but for anybody who feels emotions at any point. So this is supposed to be poetry that can be accessible to anyone. And this is good news for you guys because you guys feel feelings, right? As high school students, you've gone through things that have made you feel joyful, hopeful, sad, upset, angry, and he capitalizes on all of these emotions in his poetry. He writes for everyone. Take a look at the quote on that lower right-hand side of the screen. He once wrote that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion, recollected in tranquility. So he's talking that it's all in hindsight. You look back on the feelings that you felt and why you felt that way, and you bring that all together in your words. You are able to reflect on that through your poetry and make meaning of the feelings that you felt in certain situations. So that's a little bit about William Wordsworth for you. I want to take a look at a little bit more art from the time period so you can get a little bit more insight into how people were influenced by the scenery around them. The picture on the left is called The Oxbow, and it's by an artist named Thomas Cole. It's a more lifelike depiction of the natural landscape in the UK at the time. So a lot of rolling hills and wandering rivers. And the painting on the right is called The Slave Ship by JMW Turner, who is a little bit more abstract in his paintings and his style of art, and uses some more red and orange and yellow colors in his paintings that make it pop a little bit more, make it more dramatic. Okay, so in both paintings, you can see a contrast of light and dark skies. Both of them have the light on the right and the dark on the left. In both paintings, you can see kind of a gloom paired with a peacefulness. In the Turner painting in particular, that one is a little bit more active, a little bit more aggressive and dramatic. And it had a few different names before he settled on the name of The Slave Ship. And it's about a ship going through the ocean, and as the people on the ship are dying of malnutrition and starvation, they just threw them over the side. And this was something that he felt like he could bring to life in a very dramatic way in this painting. Some other notable romantic poets of the time period are pictured right here. We've got Keats, who is on the far left. He is the next poet we'll be reading when we're done with Wordsworth. Then you have Percy Shelley, who is to the right of him, married to Mary Shelley, who actually wrote the novel Frankenstein and created what we know to be the monster Frankenstein. Then you've got Lord Byron in the middle, William Blake on the right of him, and Coleridge on the far right, who is actually very close with Wordsworth and published poems with him in compilations at the time. They influenced each other very greatly. So today's plan, now that you've gotten a little bit of background about the movement and about William Wordsworth himself, I would like you to make sure everyone has a dark green British literature textbook at their desk, one per person. Open that up to page 688. There are going to be 3 poems on this 2-page spread between 688 and 689 that I would like you to read. They're all very short. The first one is called The World is Too Much With Us. Then the next one is called It is a Beauteous Evening, Calm and Free. And the final one is called My Heart Leaps Up. Once you're done reading those, and if I were you, I would read them a few times, really get a feel for them, try and picture them in your mind if you can. When you're done reading those poems, you're going to turn the page to 690 and you're going to respond to 3 questions for me. Question 4, 8, and 10. And I very carefully selected 1 question per poem, so pay attention to which question is asking about which poem that you've read. And I want you to really thoughtfully respond to each one of those. There's a reason I'm only having you answer 3 instead of all 12, okay? So these should get to exactly what I want you to take away from each of these poems. Please type the answers to those questions out and submit them to the proper Showbie Dropbox once you're all done. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and you will continue on talking about romantic poetry tomorrow.